Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you so much for being here. So my name is Alexandre Tamisier, and I'm an FX marketing artist intern at SideFX. So during my internship, I mainly focused on exploring new Houdini Copernicus features. So I spent time doing R&D with the flow solver, the reaction diffusion solver, and the new Pyro COP 3D. So earlier this month, I gave a talk about the flow solver at the OFF event in Montreal. So that presentation should be available on YouTube soon if you'd like to check it out. Today though, it's just about the Pyro 3D solver. So let's dive in and see what it can do. So Pyro COP is not the classic .pyro you might know. This one is written in OpenCL and runs on the Spores VDB architecture. So it's lightweight, GPU accelerated, and really fast. And the best part is it lives entirely inside Copernicus. So that means that you can build your source directly here, hit play, and see it simulating in real time. But you can still source things from SOP and bring them over if that's what you want. So I'll show you both approaches, and then we'll look at a few R&D tests, curve advection setup, a colorful explosion, and a fire tornado. So let's look at the basic building blocks. So everything starts with the Pyro block setup. And on the block begin node, you can define activation, padding, advection type, all the basics. From there, everything downstream will run sparsely on the GPU. On the Pyro block begin, you will also plug your simulation input. The key ones are density, velocity, and temperature. But there's another important one to understand, which is activate points. So we need to feed this input with points so the server knows where the sim should actually start. And so you have two different ways to create this point cloud. From a 2D layer, you can use a layer to VDB leaf points node. There is a thickness slider, so you can give that flat shape a bit of depth. And from a sub-VDB layer, you use a VDB leaf points node. And both nodes build a grid of points that tell the solver exactly where to wake up and start calculating. So now we can move on sourcing in COPs. So I take my previously generated activation point and plug it into the block begin. And next, I make the actual VDB source with the Pyro source from layer node. So I take that 2D shape and extrude it into an actual VDB. And the activate points will need to match this volume, so the voxel will wake up exactly where the source is being built. From there, you can set a thickness, boost the density if you want, and add some noise or distortion so the source doesn't feel too clean. And now we've got this VDB source layer. By default, it just fire ons. But if I create a blend node in add mode, it starts stacking frame after frame by voxel value. And that noisy source that keeps playing itself. So instead of one hit, you get this continuous feed. And with the same add blend trick, I can feed a temperature field, so it starts to build over time too. And once I drop a Pyro buoyancy node, that temperature suddenly has a meaning. And so the hotter spots rise and the cooler one stay lower. So that's really the core of a setup. And from there, I just start to play tweaking the Pyro source from layer, add some noise to break things apart. Another nice part of this solver is you can turn on live simulation. So the sim just keeps running while you change things around. Here, I scale my source and slide it over with a simple transform 2D, and the viewports react instantly. And because COPs isn't locked to 2D, I can use a transform 3D node, and suddenly that flat shape has depth. It's moving through space, and you can get richer motion. And of course, you don't have to stay in COPs if you prefer sorting things in SOP. So for example, I took the classic rubber toy, I let it rotate, grab its velocity, and rasterize it all. Then I dropped it in COPs and used geometry to layer to separate layers apart into density and velocity, so I can actually work with them. And once I feed it into the solver, you see the voxels start getting pushed around. And in conclusion, this SOP sourcing setup is a bit heavier than a pure COP setup, but it still runs smooth, and you can get to keep all the SOP flexibility you're used to. So let's compare this new COP Pyro solver to the old Pyro. So the DOP one is the full combustion model with fuel, burn, buoyancy, and all the microsolver you'd expect. But it's also pretty heavy, so it takes time to solve. And the COP Pyro is different. It's lighter and faster because it's written in OpenCL. And for now, it doesn't simulate the entire combustion cycle, but it does give you buoyancy and essential core behavior. And Copernicus is basically a 2D and 3D image processing engines. So the same multi-wire workflow you normally use for image layers also works for BDV, which makes it a nice place to build a Pyro setup. And now you can just grab all your usual image tools like blur, brighten, blend node, and so on, and apply them directly to volumes. So it feels a lot more playful and artist-friendly than the old DOP. All right, so that's the groundwork, and let's move into a breakdown. So this first one is a classic curve direction setup, but the twist is the whole Pyro sim is running inside COPs. So for this section, I show how I built my source in SOP, bring everything in to drive the sim in COPs, and then we export the feedback into SOP to use the simulation field to drive curves. I just started really small with a pop explosion, just some particles with a touch of noise so they scatter around. And then I remap these particles p-scale so sphere grow over time and then get small again. And after that, I rasterize the points into volumes, storing density and velocity, so I've got fields to actually work with. Then I pull the source in COPs and break it into layers with geometry to layer. From there, I stack in density, velocity, and temperature frame by frame in add mode. To control my motion a bit, I drop a Pyro dissipate, so density fades a little each step, and the blur on velocity will act like adding viscosity. And here is a preview of what the blur node is introducing to the motion. So by default, we get all those little details, and if we add a lot of blur effect, we get this more viscous and broad motion. So quick pause on the pass-through input. On screen, it looks like two different networks, but really it's the same node wired in a clean way. So with pass-through, you just funnel all your layers through one cable into the block begin, and then unpack them after. So it keeps the graph tidy and way easier to read. And once I was happy with the look, I ran a quick speed test. The same little Pyro explosion took about 5 seconds in COPs versus 38 in DOPs. So on its own, half a minute isn't dramatic, but as soon as you start layering more detail and have higher voxel counts, that gap becomes really attractive for fast iteration. The next step is to get all this data back into SOP so we can actually use the fields beyond just the sim. So when you pull a COP network into SOP, by default, you only get the first layer of the current node you select. So here, density. But if you switch off single output parameter, now velocity and temperature come in SOP too. And now you've got the same set of fields you'd expect from a DOP setup. So I take those fields and let them drive particles, pulling out curves that get pushed along by velocity. And from there, it's just classic Houdini. You can manipulate the p-scale or color data the same way you're used to. So this is the final result. And let's switch up and look at a more colorful Pyro explosion. So again, we create our source in SOP, to then bring it into the COP solver, and finally make a custom field in SOP to color the smoke. So I kick it off with a small pop sim. I split it into 3 layers, one shoot particles further, one keep it closer to the center, and some get a noisy push from a pop win. And together they build this layer in motion, like different behavior in the same explosion. And we end up with this drifting cloud of points. Then I run a trail on them and use an add node to start stitching points together. From this trail, I build the first rasterized attributes, which is density. I drive it with curve view, so the tip comes with high value, while the ends have more softer value. Next, I shape the p-scale, keeping it small at the tip and stretching it larger toward the end. And when rasterized to VDB, it will give that missile-like profile, like sharp in front and heavy in the back. So yeah, once I rasterize both velocity and density on those points, you start to see the full shape take form. And then I bring it into COPs. So yeah, so I put it I pull everything in COPs with a SOP import, convert the geometry to layers, and now I've got density and velocity. And from there, I add density and temperature over time. So the big shift is in how I treat velocity, swapping from a add for a max operation. And that way, the motion keeps updating without blowing up the value frame after frame. And if you compare add versus max for the velocity, you really see the difference. Add just keeps stacking energy until it blows apart, where max don't go higher than the maximum push of our source. And now we get this result, so it's a really simple effect, and now I'd like to layer some detail on it. To direct my shape, I drop first a blur node on the velocity, so it thickens things so the motion runs straighter without all that default swirling. And after that, I applied some Pyro turbulence, injecting noise into the velocity. I've applied some masking with temperature and density, so it only kicks in some areas. I wrap it up with Pyro disturbance, throwing random direction in velocity. So it's the same trick you'd use in DOPs, but here it's all running in the potential, so iterations stay fast. And quick note on advection, in the Pyro block begin, I switch over to BFECC for this one. So by default, it's advect per sharpen. It's a fast advection, but you lose some detail, and BFECC costs a bit more time, but the gain in clarity is worth it. So here's a before and after, so you can see the trade-off. And a quick speed comparison. I run a low-res version of the sim on 120 frames. In COPs, it cooked in about 9 seconds, and the same thing in DOPs is closer to 5 minutes. So a huge gap. And for the full-res 120 frames version, it took around 5 minutes in Copernicus. By the end, I was pushing about 120 million active voxels, so you can really crank up detail as long as your GPU RAM can handle it. So for measure, I ran this one on a 4080. And last part for this one, I built a custom field in SOP to bring color into the explosion. So I grabbed the original pop source, I trail it again, and this time across the full timeline. So I get these long streaks stretching through the sim. I turn those trays into curves and drop a curve view attribute. So it runs from 0 to 1, root to tip, and that becomes the driver for everything that comes after. From there, I build the sliding attributes that run along the strands, just using an attribute tree map, adding this modulo effect. And I also make a single attribute just for the tip. I use another remap, this time with a tight fall off near one value, so it only grabs the very end. And now I drop an attribute adjust color. I set 5 colors and let them randomly land on each train, and then use that tip attribute to darken the end. Final step, I use the sliding attributes to gamma, so color darkens along the curve to add subtle variation. And then I rasterize that color attribute into a field, and once it's merged and previewed with Pyrobake volume, you can actually see the color living inside the COP sim. And in Karma, this is the render you get. One small hack here, if you want vivid color for the render, just add a few extra volume sample on your wrap, and it will take a bit longer to render, but the payoff is a much richer and colorful render. So last one is the fire tornado I built in Copernicus. So this one took a while, about a month of back and forth. And I'll share a few tips and notes on how I got there, starting with a pop sim, rasterizing that data, then shaping the smoke tornado in COPs. And I wrap it up with a trick how to affect fire without simulating it, just by sculpting fields. So I start with a particular source on a simple circle, then break it apart by layering noise, punching holes, tuning the edges, adding offsets, basically anything to break that perfect symmetry. Then I drop the source into DOPs and push it around with some custom forces. And inside, I rebuilt my own version of a pop curve force inside the pop bop. I did this because the default nodes only lets you remap section and orbits from the curve itself. And in my version, I added the option to remap section and orbit along the curve, not just radially, so I could actually shape the force through its height. So I built that node from scratch using cross product and subtract operation of vectors to mimic the section and orbit of the pop curve force. And once that was in place, I could finally start layering my own tweaks on top. And that way, I can pull harder near the ground and ease it off at the top, shaping a tornado-style velocity profile without fighting with a bunch of parameters. And now with just 3 nodes, the particles just move exactly how we want, and the velocity is shaped into a clean V profile. And then I generate the attribute I need for oscillation. So here I have density on one side, temperature on the other, and they are both driven by a rest-based noise, so the pattern locks to the motion. So here you can see density, temperature, and velocity attributes are rasterized on the points before sending them into Copernicus. And in COPs, I start blending the fields, running everything through a max operation. And for velocity, I use a max set to compare lengths, so the strongest motion always wins out. So quick note on the max blend node. So by default, the max blend, what actually happens is it compares each axis on its own. So X looks at which X is bigger, Y is the same, Z as well. And what you get in the end is this kind of mixed vector stitched together from the biggest value of the two inputs. And now when we generate the new vector, this way it wipes all the negative parts. So basically anything pointing backward just disappears. And the result always lands on the positive side, so on that yellow block. But if instead you switch to max by length, now you're not checking each axis separately. You're asking which of these vectors is longer overall. So whichever one wins, and you keep the whole thing. So in this case, the yellow is the longer one, and we just keep it entirely. And the nice thing here is negative values still count. So if one of the vectors is pointing down or backward, that's still allowed. It means you can actually push things in any direction. So one is mix and match per axis, and the other winners take all by size. And as you can see, it has a huge influence on how the source motion plays in the sim. And finally, for the tornado, I drop a pyro axis force node to introduce just enough suction to keep the current tight. So on that force, everything is turned off except suction, so the voxels are only pulled toward the center. That gave me a stable tornado, but at this time, it was only smoke. So next up is fire. Here, I don't simulate the fire, I sculpt it. I start by layering rest-based noise and drive intensity with a vertical ramp that scrolls over time. And that way, the fire locks into the motion and feels alive without paying the sim cost. Then I build a relative density attribute. It measures how crowded each point is compared to a target neighbor count. So when particles bunch up, it's taken, and when they spread out, it thinns. And unlike fixed rest-based noise, this changes frame by frame, so it feels a bit more organic. And this is the tiny wrangle that does the work, so it counts the neighbors and maps that ratio through ramps. And once I've got all the attributes, I just multiply them together, and out comes this organic shape forming inside the tornado. Then I curl everything below threshold, so only a fraction of particles survive, so only the denser remain. And finally, I layer some noise that becomes the temperature field, adding variation and gradients just enough to mimic the fire color shift. Finally, I rasterize the temperature attribute. Note the feed carries both the hot intense zone and the softer cooler ones. And when I bring smoke and fire together in parabolic volume, the fire just locks into the smoke motion and follows it naturally. It feels like one system, even though the fire itself was never simulated. So the sim is one thing, but for the final image, we need some rendering and shading work. For the shader, I added as much breakup as possible and gradients into my volume fields. And I've also added a masking effect to the scatter and fire field with density, so the layers picks up extra gradient detail. Here's the shaded results, but I share a couple of quick tricks I found to push the basic render further. First, I used the new geometry light in 3D21. This new tool lets polygon or volume act as actual light source, stay in sync with material properties, so in this case, the fire color directly drives the light color. And finally, I polished the sim with render geometry settings node, tweaking the volume velocity scale parameter on density and temperature to really push that sense of speed in the tornado. So here you can see how the render evolves once those tweaks are in. And so that's the journey from building simple 2D sourcing COPs to mixing it with SOP. And all the setup will be available in the content library if you want to explore them by yourself. You will also find the dry ice effect I didn't break down today. And more of my other R&D will be there as well, like experiment with the flow solver and reaction diffusion. And now I'll show you a reel that compared the work I've done at SideFX during my first 4 or 5 months. And most of what you'll see will be available for you to explore in the content library. So before wrapping up, I just want to take a moment to thank some amazing people who really helped me make this possible. So Fiona Wong, she's my manager and has me backing me up through this journey. Attila Turok for all the Pyro support and feedback. Jeff Lake, who developed the Pyro COP solver you've seen today. And also Jeff Gutting and Nick Curver, who gave me a lot of R&D help and advice along the way. So big thanks to all of them. They are part of why I was able to share this work with you today. So that's the end of the presentation, and thank you for attending.
Hi. We are still in 20.5, looking forward to play with 21 with this. I have a question about like use cases. Where do you see these being used versus like the document, the custom one, the old one, let's call it like that. Let's say we have like a beefy card, a beefy GPU. Where is the limit? Where do you find this is not as fully featured yet as the old one, and what are the differences basically?
So like right now you don't have like all the gas burn, like the fire field, this kind of thing. So you can make some kind of like it. Yeah, you still can make like some smoke effects, like you have everything you need for. But yeah, like it just missed for now like some microsolver and stuff. So if you want to like push it maybe for like final production, maybe it's too early, but it will happen later. And like right now, I think for like motion design effect or like really simple effects, it's really fast. And like if you have like some high-end GPU with like 16 gigabytes of RAM, I was able to push it to like 120 million voxel. So it's enough for some case. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions? All right, thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you.